Hi, I'm Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents, and I'm delighted to welcome you along today to our roundtable discussion on SD-WAN Analysts Outlook, featuring Brendan Butler from IDC, Shin Umeda from Dell'Oro Group, Erin Dunne from Vertical Systems, and our chairperson today is Scott Raynovich from Futuriom. Scott, over to you to chair this session.
Great, thanks a lot, Mark. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be here for another NetEvents event. I wish we could be doing them live in Portugal or San Jose, as we have in the past, but unfortunately, we're in this new reality, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today with the ongoing pandemic and people retreating to virtual events and the move to the cloud. It's actually fueling a lot of acceleration and digital transformation. So on the SD-WAN Analyst Outlook today, I have a collection of the industry's best and brightest analysts, I'd like to say. We have Erin Dunne, Director of Research Services with Vertical Systems Group. We have Shin Umeda, who's Vice President and Analyst with Dell'Oro Group. And we have Brendan Butler, Senior Research Analyst for Enterprise Networks with IDC. Now, the format is we're going to each give a presentation and have a few quick comments and discussion after each presentation. And then we're going to open it up to a media Q&A, and then we're going to have a further roundtable after that, and this is expected to last about an hour and 15 minutes. So thanks to everybody for joining. I'm going to get on with the content in which we're going to talk about everything that we've found as analysts as we dig into this SD-WAN market. That's just a slide again. You know who I am. I'm Scott Raynovich. So since we have a lot of analysts on this panel and there's quite a bit of interesting research, both qualitative and quantitative, I'm just going to give a quick overview of SD-WAN and why I think it's important. So the interesting thing about is as the cloud has evolved, we've kind of developed this system of almost like parallel networks, if you will. We've gone through kind of several generations of networking, when we started with client server, and then there was the explosion of the internet, and then we went to data center, and then cloud. And so you have kind of remnants of each generation, as you can see. Some people still have MPLS networks, which are private, secure lines that they use to connect to headquarters to data centers or branch sites to headquarters. You can see that in the gray cloud. So there's an MPLS network out there. There's the internet out there, so people are connecting either from their home or from the office to the internet. And then you have cloud services. People are trying to get to cloud services. So what you have is all these different, these parallel networking systems and different ways of getting to these clouds, if you will, or these data centers. And what SD-WAN does really is it kind of arbitrates between these, and it finds the best way to get you where you need to go. So in the example of MPLS, what happened as SaaS and cloud services exploded, what a lot of enterprises found as they were backhauling the cloud traffic over MPLS to their data centers and then sending them out to the SaaS, the cloud network. I'd say one of the most important use cases of SD-WAN, especially in the early case, was internet breakout or detecting you're on your home broadband or you're at a branch site and you're going to a cloud service. SD-WAN knows that. It just takes you straight there over a private, a private VPN-like connection, and often connects you to the closest POP to get you there even faster. So that's an example of how SD-WAN is helping us in this modern world. It's also helping, one thing that's happened with the COVID-19 is it's kind of emphasized the need for VPNs. You can see there's a VPN gateway there, or there's often a VPN concentrator. People log onto their VPNs to get to their corporate network or get to the cloud. And SD-WAN is a sort of a built-in VPN overlay. So that is coming in handy at branch sites, and especially when people work at home. So as you can see, there's many different applications and use cases for SD-WAN, but generally the way I think of it is optimizing the way we get to the applications we need from wherever we are, whether that's at a branch or a headquarters, or as many of us are now working in our home. So let's go to the next slide. So Futuriom concentrates, we try to gather end user data constantly. We're doing 1 to 2 surveys a month, and I'm interviewing end users every day, and on various topics, of which SD-WAN is one. And we recently completed our annual SD-WAN infrastructure survey, which this is our 4th year. And we try to nail down exactly why people are buying SD-WAN and what they see the benefit of, where they see the benefits. And this year, some of the same themes emerged, though I would say some things strengthened. SD-WAN is seen increasingly as a security tool. So you can see 64% said the main benefit was to improve security tools and orchestration of security. The next one was improved management and automation. And the third, or tied for second, was better utilization of bandwidth and lowering the cost. As I mentioned at the outset, SD-WAN is often seen as a way to complement MPLS circuits or other private circuits and give you kind of a cheaper way to leverage broadband or internet in a secure fashion and lower the cost overall of your bandwidth. So that's an important feature. And then higher performance of cloud applications, really right there at the top as well. As I said, if you're trying to get to the cloud, you want to do that in the most efficient way. And SD-WAN has kind of a built-in intelligence to get you to the closest cloud server. And that is seen, obviously, very important in this era of where, most of our applications are going to the cloud. And then finally, another feature is improved analytics to understand network behavior. The network managers like the fact that SD-WAN has layer 7 intelligence and can detect what applications are being used and how they're being used, and it helps them manage the network. So let's go to the next slide. So the next question we asked a number of questions in our survey, and you can get the highlights for free on the futuriom.com website, but our subscribers get the full report. But we are trying to detect the buying patterns in SD-WAN and where people are in the cycle. And what's interesting, there are a couple questions that kind of reinforce this, but this was a very interesting one. The majority, the vast majority, 62% said they started using SD-WAN and they expect more deployments, which is kind of reinforced by many of the end users I talked to. They've been doing pilot projects or did kind of the first phase of a rollout, and say 50 sites out of 200 sites or 100 sites out of 500, and they expect to deploy it throughout the organization. And so we're kind of in the the early stages of kind of a long-running deployment. I expect it to last for years. 29% said they're still evaluating the technology. They're not sure. 8% said they have SD-WAN and they don't need to deploy anymore. And 1%, only 1% said they don't need the technology. So across the board, and then we saw this in other survey results, kind of widespread adoption of SD-WAN. The market's starting to mature, and a lot of people, they know what it is. So the biggest hurdle of the market, kind of educating people, is is done with, and now it's about evaluating and buying the technology. So that's all of my slides. I'm curious if the other analysts have any questions, or if they saw similar things, agree, disagree. What do you folks think?
Yeah, Scott, this is Brandon, and I would say the survey results that you showed are consistent with surveys that we've done at IDC. And I think the thing that strikes me about the SD-WAN market is the conversation, at least the ones that I'm having with enterprises, have shifted from a couple years ago. I think a lot of the driver for SD-WAN was around cost optimization, and now it's really being turned into a broader thinking about how can I optimize my connection to the cloud, how can I optimize connections between branch offices and the data center, wherever those applications are hosted. So I think that speaks to the maturity of the market. And as you mentioned, I think security is going to increasingly play an important role in SD-WAN as we move forward.
That's great. Thanks.
Scott, I have
Sure.
a question for you. Well, maybe two. First is, you said that this is an annual survey that you've done, I think, for 4 years. Is there anything that jumps out to you that's changed over the last 4 years? And my second question is, when you refer to, when you're asking the questions about SD-WAN, is it any kind of SD-WAN? Meaning, are they dropping in a DIY, doing it themselves, or a carrier managed network, or do you differentiate that?
Good questions, Erin. I would, first of all, no, we didn't differentiate it. We do have a managed services survey we do in the fall, which is slightly different. That's targeted at people that are strictly adopting it as a managed service. Cool. And this was either or, DIY, managed service, or hybrid. I think what I'd say over the years is the use cases have been expanding, and whereas SD-WAN was solving a few particular use cases in the beginning, particularly that optimizing the broadband links thing or offloading MPLS, it's kind of evolved into a more a broader based solution now, because you're seeing this tie in with what our friends at the analyst firm beginning with G refer to as SASE, Secure Access Services Edge, which was what I described as security orchestration. It's really using SD-WAN as a security orchestration platform. And then you throw in analytics, and then you throw in cloud acceleration, and then you throw in, these deals that many of the SD-WAN players have with the cloud players, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, for these kind of accelerated cloud pops. It's becoming broader based. It's being seen more as a generalized networking platform rather than a point solution, which I think is important.
Hey, Scott, very interesting
Sure,
on the
Shin.
results of your survey there. But I noticed that the top reasons for going with SD-WAN, there seems to be a lot of commonality that I think almost 2/3 are selecting multiple reasons. I guess I'm wondering, what is the path that a lot of these enterprises are using? There's many reasons, but ultimately, is it driven by the need to upgrade their existing infrastructure? Is it security? Is there anything that really stands out as to what's pushing these enterprises over the hump, if you will, to move into the direction of SD-WAN?
Yeah, great question, Shin. I think the commonality when I talk to, and this is where I use kind of individual interviews over surveys to get some color. The general theme when I talk to people is the automation and the cloud orchestration. It really saves them time. I mean, if they used to be, the old school way would be you had 100 sites and you had branch routers and they all had to be configured, and you often had to have a certified engineer on staff there who was plugging in cords and getting into the CLI and kind of, getting really individual attention on a specific router or branch device. And now, they can deploy and manage and orchestrate all this stuff, whether it's a router, Cisco's adding SD-WAN capabilities to their routers, or it's an open CPE device. You can orchestrate and manage that all over the cloud, so that seems to be, one of the core drivers is just management and saving people, the manager's time. But, on that note, I'm going to jump to Erin because we'll have time for more questions later, and we want to get through everybody's presentations first. So, Erin, why don't you talk about your work in the SD-WAN space?
All right. Thanks, Scott. And as Scott said, my name is Erin Dunn. I direct the research practice for Vertical Systems Group. We're a market research and consulting firm. We're based in Boston, Mass. in the USA. We also have we're a boutique firm, and we have a hyper focus on wireline data networking on the service, with a specific focus on the services perspective. Someone could flip to the next slide, please. And I make that point because it has to do with the question that I just asked Scott, is that we're going to hear from all of these analysts, and each of us are focusing on a little bit different aspect of this SD-WAN market. This is a huge market. It incorporates everything from the networking aspect to services to infrastructure to security to analytics and all those types of technologies. I am focused, and my firm is focused on carrier-managed SD-WAN services. We define that as a carrier-grade offering for business customers that's managed by a network operator, meaning you are paying a bill to a network services operator on a monthly basis. It also utilizes SD-WAN architecture, enables dynamic customer edge site connectivity, and provides centralized network control and visibility end to end. So a couple of important points here that I wanted to make. First of all, Scott mentioned about all the wonderful things you can do at layer 7. Well, we all know if layers 1, 2, and 3 aren't working, it doesn't matter what layer 7 is doing. And so we are really focusing on the networking aspect, or should we say the underlay, that powers the carrier-managed SD-WAN services. And this is how we look at this market. And so a little more detail on that. We don't need to go into it a lot, but the SD-WAN service-based SDN architecture, carrier-grade network services, and it's with centralized operations and controllers. The dynamic edge site connectivity, very important, going back to what Scott was talking about, which is some of the applications of offloading broadband, directing secure or very highly sensitive or secure traffic to the MPLS network. That does not work unless you have end-to-end control over this type of a network. So there has to be a device, from our definition, sitting at the enterprise customer prem that can control, or has to control, more than one WAN access link. Whether or not that link is in play is up to the enterprise customer. But at that point, then it can direct traffic between those 2 or 3 or more. The network control and visibility, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because the other folks after me are going to hit that. And the other services capabilities like security, like the analytics, like direct cloud connect, again, very, very important, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because Brandon and Shin certainly will. So if we can flip to the next slide. One of the things that a lot of the press know about my company, Vertical Systems Group, is we publish these lovely things called leaderboards. And they are the ranking of the top providers in a certain network, in a certain services technology. Here, you're seeing the year-end 2019 US Carrier Managed SD-WAN Services Leaderboard. These top 7 providers that you see here are the top providers, and they have 2% or more of market share for carrier SD-WAN sites within the US. That challenged here you see in gray, they have between 1 and 2%. Those are shown in alphabetical order. The top 7 are shown in rank order. A couple important things about this. First of all, it's based on sites, meaning there's a UNI that sits at the customer prem that is terminating the SD-WAN service. Number 2, This was done as of year-end 2019. So this was pre the strangeness that we've had over the last couple of months. So this is unaffected by anything that's happening. The third thing I wanted to point out here is that you see here a list of the top infrastructure providers that are powering these SD-WAN services. What we're seeing, and I think some of the analysts might be, some of the other analysts can validate this, that you're seeing a lot of these service providers now start to add what they call their SD-WAN 2.0 or a second or third or even fourth technology provider to power different SD-WAN offerings for their enterprise customers. So we're seeing a lot of movement in the type of technologies that these service providers are offering. Did want to make a point here too that this is US based. We are currently working on a global version of this for mid 2019. That was a much easier job a couple of months ago than it is right now, as any analyst can attest. But so this is the leaderboards ranking the top providers in that service. If we can flip to the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, the title of this is kind of what's happening here with SD-WAN, as COVID has hit. So this is a timeline that my organization has generated, showing almost on a monthly basis what's happening in the SD-WAN carrier managed services market. First thing, let's look back to 2019. For the revenue, we saw triple-digit growth in 2019 for SD-WAN services. We also saw almost triple-digit growth for sites. So this is a very healthy and robust market. Now, it's also early, so it's easy to get healthy and robust when things are ramping up. We saw that continue into January and February, and with no end in sight, unless something happened in March, which did. So some of the interesting things that we're seeing here, starting in March, we started to see the demand stifle due to the pandemic. Sales stopped abruptly. Installations couldn't get into the building. Enterprise customers all went home. Work from home starts to jump. The implementations are starting to either be deferred or canceled. You're seeing commercial buildings close, and supply chains are starting to be interrupted. As we moved into May to August, and things started to shift, right? There's some restrictions that started to lift, and some restrictions that started to get a little more detailed and a little more tight, based on where you were in the country or in the world. Some businesses are starting to resume operations, and others, there's no end in sight. Work from home is still continuing. And again, with some industries, a lot more folks are staying at home. Maybe they'll never go back into an office. And some industries are starting to make their way back. We're seeing some of the service providers offer some forgiveness for SD-WAN billing, and that impacts revenue, their revenue going forward. It also impacts the enterprise customer's ability to keep that service, whether or not it's going to be canceled or interrupted or continued. So what we saw is the SD-WAN implementations for this time frame dropped to about half of what we saw at the January baseline. It's a significant drop. September, October, we're looking out. I mean, a lot of this is based on what we're seeing from government entities, from the CDC, but we're starting to see some adjustment into a new operations reality. This is changing for everybody. We're starting to hope to see a little bit of demand start to increase, a little bit of the pipeline start to fill up, maybe a little bit, and some work from home employees start to shift back. November and December, we can just hope that there's a holiday bump. What do you? I'll let the other analysts jump in on that when we do some Q&A. But that's what we're looking for here. Again, this is a very robust market. The flexibility of SD-WAN allows it to be, I think, a lot more resilient in this market, in this crazy market. So that's what it was designed for. Going forward, again, the hope for is a rebound and some of the billing forgiveness to end, and we'll start to see some revenue kick back up. Pipelines start to recover, and hopefully we'll see some revenue increases and some port increases. A couple of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what the enterprises are seeing here because the other gentleman will, but we are seeing some of these issues. You got high-rise buildings, and if you have to socially distance in an elevator, it's really hard to get to the 60th floor. We're also seeing building damage and disruptions from not just COVID, but from some of the other issues that are happening today. And you're talking thousands of buildings that have been damaged and are going to take some time to recover. So lay that on top of COVID, and we're talking about a very volatile market here. So I think I'll end on that and shoot back to Scott.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. And we're getting a little bit behind on time here. So I'm going to jump to Shin. And if we have, let's hold our questions for Erin at the end. We do have a 15-minute wrap up where we can talk more. I do have a question for you, Erin, so remind me to ask it.
Okay.
Shin, let's hear what you're doing. Dell'Oro tracks a lot of the quantitative revenue, so I want to hear all about this.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Scott. And yes, I'm Shin Umeda, and I'm the analyst at Dell'Oro Group responsible for our IP routing and SD-WAN research. So we do regarding SD-WAN, we publish quarterly reports now with market share tracking. So I think one of the things that I'll focus on today is what we saw in the first quarter. As Erin pointed out, we've definitely seen the impact of COVID-19 on the market. And so I'll talk about it from the standpoint of the infrastructure, what is selling into the market for SD-WAN technology. So can we move to the next slide, please? Next slide after that. So just to kind of lay the groundwork here as to kind of how Dell'Oro Group is looking at the SD-WAN market. We know that SD-WAN is a set of technologies that Scott outlined in terms of what goes into the SD-WAN solutions. But from the standpoint of tracking this market, we look at it from many different angles. So if we kind of look at the different technologies involved and kind of how SD-WAN itself is growing and where this business is coming from. And we started with looking at this access router market, really the branch office devices that go into the all these different locations to form these wide area networks. That has traditionally been a device, the access router has been a device that is highly functional in the branch office, a lot of hardware-based technology, and it's been dominated by a single vendor. Cisco, from our tracking of the enterprise routing market, is generally in this 70% market share range for a very long time. Now, what we're seeing is that SD-WAN, with its software-centric approach, with many new vendors, is starting to become an alternative. So rather than just going with hardware device at the branch office, enterprises are starting to more and more look at SD-WAN as using a hardware device, but really focusing in on the benefits of using this centralized software-centric model of getting more control of their network, of really attacking the way the traffic has changed, traffic patterns has changed, and so it's become an alternative. So I guess the point here is that SD-WAN is not something that just emerged out of thin air, but it's really an alternative to a technology and set of technologies that existed in the past. So we look at it from that perspective of how the access routing market, which had been a $2.5 to $3 billion market, is now in a lot of ways under attack and under pressure from SD-WAN and the many new vendors there. The last point I want to make on this slide here is that network security is becoming a more and more important aspect of SD-WAN. And we're seeing that manifest in several ways. On one hand, we have the traditional NG firewall vendors moving into this space, using their position, their installed base as an entry point into SD-WAN. And also, we're seeing other vendors on the SD-WAN and access router side starting to implement and add security functionality to their solutions. So SD-WAN continues to evolve. It's becoming a broader and broader set of technologies, connectivity related, security related, and even more so as well, analytics related. So it's really a moving target, but I think in the long run, that's really where vendors will make their differentiation, their solutions, and that SD-WAN is really going to be a competitive marketplace, and I'll talk about that in a couple slides. So if we can move to the next slide. On this next slide, I'll talk a little bit here about what we saw happen in the first quarter. Now obviously, the pandemic that we're under now had some impact. So these are the SD-WAN infrastructure revenue. So the vendors selling equipment, selling software into the marketplace, and the trends we've seen over the last 8 quarters. And you can see that in the first calendar quarter on the red line here, showing the year-over-year growth rates, that we saw a pretty significant dip in the growth rate. It was still very positive. It was over 20% year on year, but considerably lower than what we've seen in recent history. As we looked into this market and talked to the different vendors, it was clear that the COVID-19 caused some problems in getting equipment to the market, partly from supply chain disruptions in equipment, but also from the ability to get out to sites, as Erin pointed out, that people just weren't able to install and move forward with some of the projects. Now, keep in mind that most of the impact of COVID in the first quarter really didn't start until the latter part of the quarter in March. Interestingly, and of course, where COVID started in Asia, that particular region was impacted from a hardware and deployment standpoint, but SD-WAN currently is not significantly large in, say, China, but we did see that some of the equipment coming from that part of the world was somewhat disrupted. So one of the things that we see in SD-WAN is a subscription revenue technology, meaning that the end users pay for a hardware device upfront, but in the long run, they pay periodic fees for the subscription of the software or the service related SD-WAN. That's important because what we saw in the first quarter was that while new deployment slowed, most of the vendors have established and created a customer base where the customers' revenue for these services and subscriptions continues regardless of new installations. So on that hand, we know that there is a revenue base for SD-WAN that just keeps chugging along. It may not grow as fast, but it's still kind of the base support of the financial model of a lot of the SD-WAN players. So on one hand, where we're seeing a slowdown in new deployments, this subscription revenue really gives this base for the companies when they have a fairly good sized install base. Kind of looking forward a little bit here for the rest of the year, a lot of the points that Erin made about the progression of recovery, it's really going to be difficult, I think, to judge how this is going to turn out. But at this point, we're expecting the SD-WAN market to grow in double digits this year, but considerably lower than we've seen in recent history. Last year, for example, the market grew over 60% year on year. We don't think that it's going to be anything near that. There will be growth, but at this point, it's really going to be tempered a bit. But still, we think that the market is still on track for a pretty solid year. Maybe we can go to the next slide here. So the last slide that I have here is really just a kind of a high-level view of kind of how this market is shaping up in terms of market share. So on the left-hand side is the combined access routing and SD-WAN market, right? So on a 4-quarter trailing basis, so this is the last 4 quarters, you can see that SD-WAN, it represents just a little over a third of that market. So it is growing and becoming a pretty substantial part of that market. And as I mentioned earlier, that access router market is really dominated by Cisco. So on the left-hand side of this chart, the access routing market has really one vendor who dominates that space. But as we move to the right, we can see that the SD-WAN market and the breakout of the SD-WAN market is really dominated and concentrated in a relatively small number of vendors. Right? Now, this list of vendors doesn't necessarily mean that these are all the top players in the market. We think it's going to be quite fluid to some degree, but still, when we look at the market results in recent history here, 8 vendors accounted for over 3/4 of the market. And we know just from looking at vendors' products, their spec sheets, and their offerings that there are probably something along the lines of 50 or more vendors with SD-WAN solutions in the world. So I guess the takeaway that we're seeing here, and I think it's something we've expected to some degree, is that the market is consolidating around a smaller number of vendors. And I think one of the things that we are anticipating is that as the market slows down in these next year or so, created by this pandemic that we're facing, that there's potentially an opportunity for consolidation in this industry amongst the vendors, right? So the consolidation can be for many reasons. For example, we recently saw an acquisition of Palo Alto Networks, so CloudGenix, which will put them right into the list of vendors here with the competing technology. We've seen other vendors acquire other components to enhance their SD-WAN portfolio, particularly around analytics and security. So I think it'll be interesting in terms of what we think that could happen here, perhaps even accelerated by the pandemic as companies either see an opportunity to expand their portfolios, or other companies perhaps start to see the market tightening up and being forced to make some decisions around how to move forward. So that's what I've got to show today, and maybe we can move to questions if we have time for that.
That's great. Shin, we're running just a few minutes behind, and I want to give Brandon his airtime. So I wrote down some questions that we'll put in the wrap up, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Anybody else has them? Brandon, let's hear what you got, man.
Great, thanks, Scott, and thanks to NetEvents for including me here. My name is Brandon Butler. I'm a senior research analyst at IDC. At IDC, we have a handful of analysts who are covering the SD-WAN market from multiple perspectives. I specifically cover it from the enterprise networking perspective. We have other folks who are looking at it from the data center, from the carrier side, from the managed services side as well. But I'm going to talk to you about some of the overall trends that we see from the enterprise side. So we can move on to the next slide. So in terms of the COVID impact on this market, this is how IDC is thinking about the impact of COVID on the entire IT market, not specifically to SD-WAN, but SD-WAN does fall into that. And, you hear a lot about flattening the curve with respect to the virus, but we are thinking about flattening the curve in terms of business investments in technology right now. And so you can see at the bottom, the economic situation, we expect this journey that we're going to be going on, and Erin spoke to this a little bit, in terms of the economic situation, the macro environment that enterprises are in right now is going to go on this journey from a crisis mode into the slowdown, which we've seen, into a recession, and somewhat of a return to growth, and then a new normal. And then at the same time, you can see at the top, enterprises have different levels of focus as they go through this journey as well. So the initial phase was around business continuity and cost optimization. Now we're getting into the era of business resiliency. And this is the really important one of targeted investments. So from surveys that we've done are showing that investments in IT spending are dropping because of COVID, but there are targeted investments that are going to be made for important technologies, and one of those is going to be around SD-WAN. So we can go to the next slide. And so we have been surveying enterprises on a bi-monthly basis at IDC since March, and this is going to continue to August. So every 2 weeks, we're doing a global survey. And this is actually a survey data point that was taken from June, so the first part of June, where we asked how organizations investment plans for wide area networking, including SD-WAN, have been impacted by the COVID situation. And so the big takeaway for me from this is that SD-WAN is a relatively resilient market. So you can see almost half of respondents were saying that they don't expect any changes, or they're actually going to be accelerating their investments. So as we talked about with the opportunity for some targeted investments in technology, we believe that SD-WAN could be one of those areas that could see targeted investments. Now, why is that? It's because, and some of the other panelists have mentioned this, but there's really an opportunity for enterprises through SD-WAN to optimize the connections that they make across their wide area network. So whether those are connections between the branch office and the data center, or between their data center and the cloud, or their branch offices in the cloud, software-defined wide area networking really allows enterprises to not only ensure experience and quality of experience across those links, it also represents a cost optimization tool for those enterprises. So as organizations are increasingly relying on cloud-based applications to ensure business continuity and to ensure remote management, and not having to rely on applications that are hosted in data center that they have to manage if they can't go into that data center. So we expect increased investment in cloud services, and in turn, we expect enterprises to increasingly invest in software-defined wide area networking to be able to enable those connections to the cloud and to the data center. And we can move on to the next slide. So this is really showing the evolution of the SD-WAN market, and some of the other panelists touched on this as well. So the way the IDC thinks about this evolution is what we're calling the software-defined branch, or SD branch. And so we think about this evolution of the market really starting in a WAN optimization technology, and then moving on to the idea of having a hybrid WAN that would incorporate maybe broadband with MPLS or with cellular, and then moving into the software-defined management of that hybrid wide area network, which would be SD-WAN. That's having a centralized policy controller for being able to optimize the traffic across those links. So the next major phase that we expect the SD-WAN market to go into is what we're calling SD branch. And this is really the idea of incorporating additional network and security functionality directly into the SD-WAN offering. And so some of the other panelists had touched on this in terms of some of the security functionality that we're seeing integrated directly in with SD-WAN. And you can see some of the other functions that we expect to be deployed with SD-WAN to create an SD branch. So a virtualized router would be sort of a base level technology that we would expect to see in SD branch to enable SD-WAN, but also a next generation firewall, maybe a secure web gateway, or a wireless controller. We're seeing intrusion prevention and intrusion detection services being integrated directly in with SD-WAN capability. And so as SD-WAN vendors and the managed service providers who are offering SD-WAN as a service increasingly offer these additional network and security functions that are packaged and integrated in with that SD-WAN offering. That's what we at IDC call a software-defined branch. And we really expect this to drive the SD-WAN market into the future. You know, I would say in the first couple of years of the SD-WAN market, it was really a conversation about routing. How do I optimize the connections between the various points in my network, between the branch office and the data center, or the data center and the cloud? Now it's a broader discussion about how do I manage what's happening at the edge of my network. And when you get into that broader discussion, then there are multiple other scenarios that enterprises need to consider. They need to consider what is the security, what is the visibility and the analytics that they need at the edge of their networks, what is the gateway that they have for getting into the cloud. And so that's why we're seeing these SD-WAN vendors increasingly package these functions together, or they're looking to partner with third parties who can offer these as an integrated solution that they can bring to enterprises. And so you can see the survey data point we have here. We asked what enterprises believe are the top benefits that they would get from an SD branch deployment. So the ability to have cloud-like scalability to scale up and down the capacity of these functions as needed, the ability to get new versions of these features quickly was important as well, and being able to centrally manage them. I will say that we are in the early days of the transition to SD branch. So we're starting to see vendors come out with these integrated platforms that we call SD branch. But there are still some management challenges, and so we expect those to smooth out, and we expect enterprises to continue to adopt SD branch into the future. So with that, I'll hand it back to Scott. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. I'll start. You know, let's do a couple questions with the analysts, since we didn't have time to get after each presentation, and then we'll go to the media Q&A in about 5 minutes, if that's okay. But I have a real quick question for all the analysts. If somebody wants to pipe up first, maybe Shin first, because Shin mentioned this thing that I'm always perplexed by, that there's people saying there are 50 plus SD-WAN vendors or 60 plus SD-WAN vendors, and I run into the same thing that Shin explained, which is really it's really 10 to 12 of them controlling most of the revenue. Has anybody run into the obscure SD-WAN startup that actually is doing something completely different? I mean, how are these other 40 SD-WAN vendors going to survive?
Yeah, I think I can start with that, Scott. Yeah, I think, you know, as I pointed out on my first slide there, that we have you know, really different aspects of where the technologies are coming from, whether it's the routing companies, whether it's security companies or startups, right? So it's such a mix of companies, right? Some are just software-based, some are analytics-based, moving into SD-WAN. So it's really hard to sometimes decipher exactly what companies are doing, other than positioning themselves in this market. So I guess maybe to your question, you know, how can these, you know, what's going to happen is, you know, it's hard to say, but, you know, it's really difficult to gain momentum, to gain the installed base to, you know, to sustain the business, right? So I think that's kind of what we're starting to see, is this consolidation around a relatively small number. It becomes a financial question, not necessarily a technology question, right? You can only go as far as, you know, the money coming in. So you know, we're now, you know, 4 or 5 years into SD-WAN kind of as a market, and not every company is going to be able to keep moving along developing products unless they you know, start to see some of the returns on that investment.
Great.
Yeah, Scott, and I can answer that just by saying that we have seen some merger and acquisition activity in the SD-WAN market. Shin had mentioned the recent acquisition of CloudGenix by Palo Alto Networks, and so we expect that to continue with this long tail of SD-WAN vendors. We've seen some other M&A in this market as well. Obviously, a couple of years ago, VMware buying VeloCloud and Cisco with Vitello. So we expect that to continue, and we also expect to see some other vendors move into this market increasingly. For example, HP Aruba is a company that's increasingly talking about the SD branch market and building these integrations between the enterprise campus and Wi-Fi environments out to the branch. So this is a competitive environment. We expect some M&A to happen, but it's also a market where we expect to see more vendors talk about the networking opportunities that they can enable for enterprises at the edge of their networks.
Great. Erin, what do you see from the services perspective in terms of the vendor layout? It's still fairly concentrated even at the service providers, correct?
Right. So that one mention that I had on the leaderboard slide can be distilled down. Is that Cisco was not huge into this market at the beginning, right? There was an acquisition, as Brendan just talked about, with Vitello. Their Meraki portfolio, depending on how you define SD-WAN, could or could not be considered an SD-WAN technology. It is now, but what we saw is that a lot of the enterprises would beat on their service provider and say, I'm a Cisco shop. I want to stay with Cisco. I want you to offer me a Cisco SD-WAN solution. And that was, I think, the primary driver that we saw for a lot of the Cisco ads on the service provider side. That was strictly enterprise driven. And then you saw the next wave, which was the service providers wanted to offer two very distinct type of SD-WAN services. One that was maybe highly managed, and one that was maybe less or more for co-managed, more WAN op, more something like that. So those were the two drivers: Cisco plus diversity. I would love to hear from my colleagues here if you saw something different.
Yeah, no, like I said, I keep seeing the same 10 to 12 players. I don't, I'd love to see something new and interesting. I'm also surprised. I mean, everybody mentioned consolidation and M&A. Gee, that's fine and dandy, but one per year ain't going to do it, man. If there's 40 companies trying to be bought out or have an exit, and there's one happening per year, it's going to take us 40 years, right? So I don't, you know, a lot of these guys are going to get failed. Are going to fail. Thanks everybody for joining us, and it was a pleasure. I want to thank NetEvents for including all of us, and check out our research. And this is a fun market to watch, and I'm sure it's going to be more fun.